My name is Corinne Greylake, and I turned 70 last spring. Most mornings I wake before the lake stirs habit from decades of library work where silence was sacred and time moved in hushed increments. I like order, routine, and knowing where things belong. Grief changed that. Since my husband died, the days have blurred into something shapeless, like fog hanging over the water. That evening began like any other. I was on the porch of my house overlooking Lake Superior, a cup of chamomile steaming between my palms. The air smelled of pine and early frost. Across the rippling surface, the light was dimming into that violet color that means the world is about to turn cold. Then out of nowhere, the quiet broke. A car appeared at the curve of the dirt road that winds down to the shoreline. Silver sedan, headlights cutting through dusk. Even before I saw her face, I knew it was Leda, my daughter. I hadn't seen her in nearly 2 months. The last time she'd come, she'd slammed the door so hard, the picture of her father fell off the wall. She was driving too fast for that narrow path. Gravel sprayed as she hit the brakes at the water's edge. My heart lifted to my throat. I set my cup down, stood gripping the porch rail. Leda got out her hair loose, her face pale in the low light. She went straight to the trunk. No hesitation. The sound of the latch echoed across the cove. Then she hauled out a leather suitcase, brown, heavy-looking, the kind meant for long trips. I recognized it instantly. I'd given it to her years ago when she moved to Minneapolis. She had laughed back then, saying she'd rather carry memories than luggage. Now she staggered toward the lake, both arms trembling under the weight. My mouth opened to call out, but no sound came. The waves slapped quietly at her boots. She swung the suitcase once, twice, and on the third motion, let it go. It hit the water with a sickening hollow splash. For a moment, it floated dark against the pale reflection of the sky, then began to sink. Leda stood there watching until the ripples vanished. Then she turned, ran back to the car, and was gone before I could reach the steps. I stood frozen, the echo of the splash lingering in my ears. Then came something else. Faint, muffled, a sound that didn't belong to water or wind. A whimper, small, wet, impossible. My body moved before my mind could stop it. Down the slope across the damp grass into the icy shallows. The cold punched through my jeans as I reached the sinking shape, grabbed the strap, and pulled with all the strength my age allowed. The suitcase was heavier than reason. When I finally dragged it onto the shore, my hands slipped on the latch. I yanked the zipper. It jammed, then gave. Inside, wrapped in a soaked blue blanket, was a baby, a newborn. Still, silent. I fell to my knees, the lake wind cutting through me as if I were made of paper. That was the moment the world stopped making sense, and the night my life began again. The first thing I remember after the scream that wasn't a scream was the sound of my own breath, broken, ragged, useless. I pressed 2 fingers against the baby's neck, searching for something beneath the chill of his skin. Nothing. Then the faintest pulse, thin as thread, fragile as belief. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone. The screen slipped twice before I managed to dial 911. My voice came out in pieces. "Please, there's a baby. He's not breathing at Meridian Point by Lake Superior. Please hurry." The dispatcher's tone was calm, but far away. "Ma'am, can you confirm your exact address?" I looked around at the darkening shoreline, the pine silhouettes, the curve of my dock barely visible. "I don't know, no street sign, just the lake house." "I'm 3 miles east of Highway 61 past the old quarry." "Please just send someone." "Stay on the line," she said. "Keep the infant warm. Do not attempt chest compressions unless breathing stops completely." Warm. How do you warm something when the night itself feels like glass? I tore off my jacket, wrapped it around the baby, then pulled him to my chest, rocking, whispering words I didn't remember knowing. The tiny body was limp, but not gone. I felt movement, small, involuntary, like air fighting its way home. Headlights appeared down the ridge, flashing red and blue through the fog. I ran toward them, water still dripping from my hair, shouting, waving my arms. 2 paramedics jumped out, a man and a woman, both young, both suddenly all that stood between life and loss. Over here, I called. He was in the water. They took the baby from me with precision that looked cruel until I realized it was skill. The woman, paramedic Sloan, cut open the blanket, pressed a stethoscope to his chest. Weak heartbeat, core temp low. The man shouted into his radio. Infant male, possible drowning, initiating transport to St. Luke's. They wrapped the baby in a silver thermal sheet, inserted a tiny oxygen mask, and climbed into the ambulance. Someone guided me inside after them. My clothes clung cold to my skin. My breath fogged the interior glass. The siren began slicing through the quiet like a blade. I sat on the bench beside the cot, staring at the small bundle under lights that made everything look sterile and too bright. The paramedic's voice blurred with static and speed. Pulse 45 and rising, respiration irregular, ETA 12 minutes. I gripped the edge of the bench to stop shaking. The smell of disinfectant and lake water mixed into something metallic. At the hospital entrance, the doors burst open. Nurses in blue scrubs met us with a rolling crib and plastic shields. One of them took the baby from the paramedic, speaking fast. Newborn male, hypothermic, possible aspiration. I stumbled after them down the corridor past glass doors and machines that hissed and beeped. My shoes left muddy prints. Someone stopped me gently, a nurse with dark curls pinned behind her ears, calm eyes behind fogged glasses. Her name tag read, Keely Sands, RN, NICU. Ma'am, she said softly, let us work. We'll update you as soon as we can. I nodded, but my body didn't move. She put a hand on my arm, warm, steady, the kind of touch that feels like a promise. Through the viewing window, I watched them place the baby under a heat lamp, attach sensors to his chest, insert a narrow tube into his mouth. Steam rose from the warm air system as the machines began their quiet battle. Keely returned a few minutes later. We're initiating rewarming protocol, gradual, not too fast. He's responding. Responding, I echoed. She nodded once. Faint, but steady. You found him just in time. The words didn't fit inside me. My knees gave way, and she helped me into a chair. Somewhere in the background, a doctor gave orders. The tone clipped, but focused. I stared at my hands, wrinkled, trembling, streaked with mud, and realized I could still feel the weight of that suitcase in my palms. It wasn't only the cold I couldn't shake. It was the memory of who threw it. A nurse offered me a blanket, but no warmth could touch the chill that had settled under my skin. Outside, the ambulance lights faded across the glass doors, and I was left with the hum of machines and the faint, rhythmic beeping that meant he was still alive. For the first time in hours, I let myself breathe. Morning came as a colorless blur. The sky outside St. Luke's Hospital was the same dull silver as the floors inside, and every surface smelled faintly of bleach and coffee gone cold. I sat in a waiting chair with a blanket around my shoulders, watching people move through the corridors with the quiet rhythm of those who save lives for a living. The baby was alive, breathing on his own, though still in the incubator. Nurse Keely had told me that much before she went off shift. He's stronger than he looks, she'd said with a tired smile. Stronger than any of us, I thought. A woman in a dark gray coat appeared at the doorway. She had short hair, pale from winter, and eyes that didn't flinch when they met mine. She introduced herself as Detective Farrah Kincaid, Duluth Police Department. The way she spoke, steady, deliberate, made every word feel official, like something that would end up typed in a report. Mrs. Graylake, she said, pulling a chair close. I need to go over what happened last night. You said you saw your daughter at the lake. I nodded. My throat felt raw from crying. Yes, Lita Hart. She threw the suitcase into the water. I was standing on my porch. I saw her. Farah opened a small notebook. Time of sighting. Just before sunset. Maybe 5:30. It was getting dark. She wrote quickly, then glanced up. Did you speak to her? Hear her say anything? No. She didn't look at me. She just did it. Farah hesitated, tapping her pen. Mrs. Greylake, there's something we need to clarify. We located a silver sedan registered to your daughter. Traffic cameras place that vehicle on the freeway toward Minneapolis at 5:21 p.m., about the same time you say you saw her at the lake. The words felt like a hole opening under me. That's not possible. It was her. I know my own child. I'm not saying you didn't see someone, Farah replied gently, but right now we can't confirm who it was. The room tilted slightly, as if the walls were breathing. My certainty so fierce hours ago began to crack. What if the shock, the twilight, the years of wanting her back, all of it blurred? What I saw. Farah closed her notebook. We'll run DNA on the infant. That'll tell us more. For now, the hospital's cooperating with Child Protective Services. As if summoned, another figure appeared. Tall, crisp blouse badge clipped to her collar. Orlane Brecht, social worker. Her expression was professional. Practiced at staying calm when everyone else fell apart. Mrs. Greylake, she said softly, until maternity can be confirmed, the baby is considered a ward of the state. He'll remain in NICU under hospital custody. You can visit during open hours, but you can't make medical or legal decisions yet. I wanted to argue to claim him to say he's my blood, but the words stuck. The blanket on my lap might as well have been made of stone. Farah gave a nod to Orlane, then turned back to me. You did the right thing calling for help. Whatever comes next, that matters. They left me with a clipboard of forms I could barely read. My hands shook so badly, the pens scratched through the paper. Through the glass, I saw the baby's small chest rise and fall beneath a maze of wires. For the first time since last night, I didn't know what to believe, my eyes, my heart, or the cold precision of the evidence waiting to prove me wrong. By the time I got home, dawn had already broken over Lake Superior, though the light did nothing to warm it. The water was calm again, flat and silver, as if last night had been a dream I'd dragged into daylight. But the mud stains on my jeans, the ache in my arms, and the sting of lake water on my skin said otherwise. The front porch creaked beneath my weight. The air smelled faintly of wet pine and porcelain dust. Near the steps, the shattered remains of my teacup still glimmered in the pale light, sharp white shards among pine needles. I crouched to collect them, each fragment cutting slightly into my fingertips. The tea had long dried into brown stains that looked almost like blood. Inside the house felt too still. The grandfather clock ticked its hollow rhythm, and the faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. I slipped off my boots by the door and noticed the trail I'd left the night before. Muddy footprints, smudges of lake water leading from the porch to the phone in the kitchen. A single towel lay crumpled on the floor, soaked through. It was all real. I set the pieces of the cup in the sink and gripped the edge of the counter. 8 years had passed since I last heard my husband's voice in this kitchen, but I could still hear it if I let myself soft, steady, with that northern drawl that made even bad news sound gentle. Corinne. He'd say, grief's a tide, don't fight it. Let it roll through. He'd died in his sleep, heart giving out before morning. The doctor called it peaceful. I never found peace in it. I walked into the living room and sat in the chair by the window, the same one I used to read from when Leda was little. The upholstery had faded, but her initials were still carved into the wood beneath the armrest. I ran my fingers over them. LH, 1989. She'd been 6, laughing, insisting it made the chair hers forever. When she grew older, everything I did seemed to irritate her. My way of talking, my questions, my silence. She said I treated her like a child. Maybe I did. Maybe I couldn't let go of the small, bright girl who once sat by the window eating cinnamon toast, telling me she'd build her own life far from this cold lake. Our last conversation, still echoed sharp, unfinished. It had been 3 months ago at this very table. She'd driven up for the weekend, said she wanted to talk business. I should have known better. Lita never used that word unless money was involved. She'd just lost her job in Minneapolis. I'd offered to help quietly, but she cut me off. I don't need a handout, Mom. I just need what's fair. What's fair, I'd asked, setting down my mug. My inheritance. Early. I remember blinking, unsure I'd heard her right. Your inheritance, Lita. I'm not dead. She rolled her eyes. It's my father's money, too. You're just sitting on it while I'm drowning. Your father wanted that fund for your future, not for patching bad choices. Her chair scraped back hard. You don't get to judge me. I'd said something then, something small but cruel. Then stop acting like a stranger. She'd stared at me, eyes wide and wet, then turned for the door. The slam rattled the windows. I hadn't heard from her since. Now, standing in the silence, I wished I'd said anything else. Anything gentler. My throat tightened. Every creak of the house sounded like accusation. I wandered to the porch and looked toward the lake. The water was still again the same way it had been the morning after my husband's funeral, too calm to trust. I imagined Lada's car lights cutting through that darkness, her hands gripping the wheel, the weight of that suitcase in the trunk. Had I pushed her away so far that she couldn't reach for help? The reflection of the water shimmered against the window pane, casting moving shadows across the floor. I stood there until my knees began to ache, unable to tell where memory ended and guilt began. The lake held its silence, and so did I. 2 days later, the hospital called. The tone of the nurse's voice told me everything, before her words did steady practice, yet carrying the faint hesitation of someone about to change another person's life. Mrs. Greylake, she said. Detective Kincaid asked that you come in this afternoon. It's regarding the test results. I arrived before noon, my heart beating with the rhythm of the elevator doors. The same hallway as before. White walls, soft beeps, the sterile smell of survival. Detective Farrah Kincaid was waiting near the NICU, a folder tucked under her arm. Her expression was calm but serious, as if she'd rehearsed this moment. Let's talk in the family room, she said. The room was small. 2 chairs, a table, a window overlooking the hospital parking lot, where snow had begun to fall in slow, disinterested flakes. Farah sat opposite me, opened the folder, and began without delay. The DNA analysis came back this morning, she said. The infant shares roughly 25% of his genetic markers with you. I stared at her. The words hung in the air, cold and bright. What does that mean? It means, she said carefully, that the baby is your biological grandson. My breath caught. For a moment, the sound of the room disappeared. Only the ticking of the wall clock remained sharp and rhythmic, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. My grandson. I repeated the words, tasting strange. Lita's child. Farah nodded. Yes, the test is conclusive. We double-checked the results. The air inside me shifted, part disbelief, part wonder, part horror. My daughter, who had once thrown her dolls into the lake pretending they were boats, had thrown her own child instead. Farah closed the folder and leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Greylake, I need to be clear. Until we locate your daughter, this remains an open criminal investigation. You are not under suspicion, but you must not attempt to contact her. Do you understand? I nodded, though the words barely registered. She hasn't called, I murmured. Not once. We've issued a notice to locate her vehicle, Farah said. She's likely avoiding communication. If she reaches out, let us know immediately. Her tone softened a fraction. The baby's stable for now. The doctors are calling him Baby Doe until proper identification can be filed. Not Baby Doe, I said before I could stop myself. No child should be called that. Farah tilted her head, curious. What would you prefer, Arlo? I said after a moment. His name should be Arlo. It was the name my husband once mentioned if we'd ever had a grandson. I didn't know why it came so easily, it just fit. Farah made a small note in her file. All right, Arlo it is. The medical team can use that as a temporary name. When she left, I sat in silence. Snow fell harder outside, covering the parking lot in white. I pressed my palms together, trying to steady the shaking. My grandson. My blood. A nurse knocked softly and led me back to the NICU. Inside, the hum of machines wrapped around the tiny plastic crib like a mechanical lullaby. Arlo, so small, he barely filled the blanket, was breathing on his own. Now his skin a little less pale. Tubes still traced his body like thin vines, but he was fighting. Keely Sands was there again, adjusting a monitor. She smiled faintly when she saw me. He's a strong one, she said. His lungs are improving oxygen steady. It's almost a miracle. I stood beside the incubator, afraid to breathe too close, afraid that even hope might break him. His tiny hand twitched once the faintest motion, but it felt like an entire sentence spoken from another world. He's my grandson, I whispered half to myself. He doesn't know it yet, but he's not alone. Keely glanced at me, her eyes softening. Then he's already luckier than most. I stayed there long after she left, watching the snow blur against the glass, listening to the fragile rhythm of the machine that kept Arlo's heartbeat steady. Somewhere in this same city, my daughter was hiding. Somewhere she was breathing the same air, carrying the same blood. And somewhere between those truths, I realized grief had changed its shape, turning from loss into something fiercer, heavier, unrelenting. It wasn't mourning anymore. It was protection. The snow hadn't melted yet, though the calendar said spring was close. The lake outside was locked in dull gray ice, the kind that looks solid, but whispers when you walk too near. I hadn't gone down there since that night. The house with its still air and ticking clocks had become my whole world again, but now every corner held questions instead of comfort. The envelope from the hospital sat on the kitchen table, still sealed. Arlo's temporary medical release forms, Keely had said. But I couldn't bring myself to open them. Not yet. I kept staring at the baby's name, Arlo Greylake, typed neatly across the front. It made him real, permanent, tethered to me by something both miraculous and unbearable. That morning, I went into the attic to look for blankets. The light up there was the pale gold of old wood and dust, soft but merciless. I had stored my husband's things in labeled boxes years ago, tax records 2008, 2013, Lita's schoolwork insurance policies. Everything neat, everything in its place. But one box had shifted half open, a corner of yellowed paper, sticking out like a hand asking to be seen. It was an old file from my lawyer dated 9 years back. The top sheet read, Last Will and Testament, Corinne Greylake. I remembered signing it after my husband's death, when I was terrified of leaving Leda alone with too much too soon. My lawyer Daniel had suggested adding clauses for clarity. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. I sat cross-legged on the floorboards, the air cold enough to fog my breath, and began to read. Near the bottom of the second page, a paragraph caught my eye, one I barely remembered discussing. In the event that a direct descendant of my daughter, Leda Hart, is living at the time of my death, my estate shall pass in full to said descendant, managed through trust until legal age. Leda Hart shall be excluded as primary beneficiary in that instance. I read it twice, my fingers going numb. If a grandchild existed, everything this house, the savings, the land, would bypass her completely. I set the paper down, heartbeat drumming in my ears. The implications bloomed in slow, awful clarity. Leda had always known about my will. She'd been there when Daniel explained it. We'd argued about it once briefly when she was 25. She'd called it unfair, said it showed I didn't trust her. I'd told her it was just precaution. And now, if she'd learned she was pregnant and realized what that clause meant, if she'd known the baby's existence would cut her off entirely, the attic air seemed to thicken. I pressed my hand against my chest. The thought was too cruel to hold, but it fit with the shape of everything that had happened. The disappearance, the lies, the lake. By the time I came downstairs, the will was clutched in my hand like evidence of a crime no one wanted to name. That afternoon, I drove to the police station. The roads were slick. The snow half melted into slush that hissed beneath the tires. Detective Farrah Kincaid met me in her office, a small space crowded with case files, and a dying plant by the window. She looked up when she saw the papers. "I need to show you something," I said, my voice smaller than I meant it to be. She took the document, read in silence. Her brow tightened slightly. "This clause, when did you sign this?" "After my husband died. Lita knew about it." Farrah set the will down carefully. "You think she might have seen the baby as a threat to her inheritance?" "I don't want to think that," I whispered. "But she's always been proud, desperate to stand on her own but never quite able to. And when she realized she couldn't fix her life," Farrah exhaled through her nose, thoughtful. "This helps us. Motive matters. It could explain her actions if we can prove intent. We'll get a copy from your lawyer for the record." Her tone was calm, procedural, but beneath it something darker flickered. When I left her office, dusk was falling. The street lamps cast thin halos over the wet pavement. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened, staring at my reflection in the windshield. The face that looked back at me was one I barely recognized, lined hollow-eyed, colder than the woman who had pulled a suitcase from a lake. Love, I thought, isn't always gentle. Sometimes it curdles into something sharper, something that cuts through even the blood that made it. And once it breaks, it never fits back the same. That night, the lake froze over again. A thin sheet of ice spread across its surface like a lie retold until it hardened. From my window, I could see my reflection ghosted on the glass, an old woman staring at a younger woman's mistakes. Lita had been brilliant once. Everyone in town said so. She'd skipped 2 grades, won the state science fair, and talked about leaving Duluth the way other girls talked about summer weddings. "You and Dad can have the lake," she used to say, laughing. "I want skylines." I'd thought it was pride ambition. Maybe it was just hunger, the kind that makes you mistake distance for freedom. She met Dorian Kells the summer she turned 19. He was 30, handsome, in the glossy, temporary way of people who sell more dreams than they ever keep. He'd come through Duluth claiming to start a renewable design firm. In truth, he was just a man who liked being adored by women who hadn't yet learned to doubt. Lita fell for him so fast it frightened me. She started skipping family dinners, then whole weekends. When she did come home, she carried his cologne like perfume. I remember the night I found her crying on the porch, mascara running down her cheeks. "He says I don't trust enough," she'd whispered. "He says I act like you." It was the first time I realized I might be part of the damage. She went back to him anyway. They moved to Minneapolis together, renting an apartment near the river. She called less often after that. When she did, her voice was brittle, her stories shorter. Once, I caught her slipping and saying "we" when talking about her job, then quickly correcting it to "I." I never asked what she meant. When Dorian's company collapsed under fraud accusations, she came home for 2 weeks. She said she needed space to think. I cooked her favorite soup, tried not to pry, but every conversation veered toward money. She was behind on rent, on bills, on everything. "You have a house, Mom," she'd said, her voice trembling. "You have savings. You could help." "I already have," I reminded her gently. "You've just forgotten the shape of it." The fight that followed burned hotter than any we'd ever had. She accused me of hoarding, of playing saint while watching her drown. I accused her of trying to buy peace she hadn't earned. When she left, she didn't slam the door this time. She just walked out silent and calm, as though she'd already decided she was done being my daughter. For 3 weeks, nothing. Then the postcard arrived, just an image of the Minneapolis skyline at night. On the back, 3 words in her neat handwriting, "I'll manage, Mom." And for a while I believed she would, until I stopped hearing from her altogether. Now, years later, standing by that same frozen water, I could almost see her reflection layered over mine, the same eyes, the same stubborn mouth. I'd raised her to be strong, but strength without mercy becomes something else entirely. The wind swept across the ice, carrying faint cracks that sounded almost like laughter. I closed my eyes, remembering how fiercely she'd loved, how fiercely she'd fought to be seen. Maybe she hadn't learned cruelty from strangers. Maybe she'd learned it from watching me hold the world at arm's length and call it survival. The packet from social services arrived on a Wednesday, thick enough to feel like punishment. The envelope bore the neat signature of Orlane Brecht, the social worker who always managed to sound kind and unmovable at the same time. Inside were instructions, applications, disclosures, 40 pages of printed suspicion dressed as procedure. When I called her office, she picked up on the 3rd ring. "Mrs. Greylake," she said, her tone calm but clipped. "I know it looks overwhelming. But these are the state requirements for temporary guardianship." "Guardianship," I repeated. "He's my grandson." "I understand that," she said gently. "But until the court finalizes custody, you'll need to complete the foster certification steps: psychological evaluation, home safety inspection, proof of financial stability. It's not personal, it's policy. Not personal." I stared at the kitchen counter where my husband's old coffee tin now held unpaid bills and receipts from the hardware store. "I raised a daughter," I said quietly. "I can raise a boy. I believe you," she said. "But the state needs to see it on paper." The first appointment was the psychological evaluation. A young woman with horn-rimmed glasses ushered me into a windowless office and spoke in the soft voice reserved for the elderly or the fragile. "Tell me about your stress levels," she began. I watched my daughter throw a suitcase into a lake. I said before I could stop myself, "There was a baby inside." I pulled him out. "He's alive." She blinked twice and looked down at her clipboard. The questions after that were easier. "Do you sleep well? Do you drink? Have you felt hopeless recently?" I lied to half of them. I wasn't trying to deceive anyone. I just didn't want to be labeled broken before I'd even begun. The home inspection came next. Orlane arrived wearing a winter coat and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She carried a clipboard and a tablet that made beeping sounds as she moved from room to room. "Any firearms in the home? Number. Working smoke detectors?" "Yes, 3. Secure storage for cleaning chemicals." "They're under the sink," I said. "Not secure enough," she murmured, noting something on her tablet. When she left, she thanked me for my time, but not for my effort. The silence she left behind filled every corner of the house. That evening, Keely Sands stopped by after her shift. She brought a small bag of baby-proofing supplies, outlet covers, drawer locks, a gate for the stairs. "If they're going to judge you," she said, smiling softly, "might as well give them nothing to complain about." I helped her screw the locks into place. My hands ached from the cold, but the steady rhythm of work was comforting. "They think I'm too old," I said. "You're not too old," Keely replied. "You're just from a time when love didn't need documentation." That made me laugh, a short, cracked sound I barely recognized as my own. When she left, I walked through the house, testing each latch, each gate. Everything gleamed with sterile safety. Yet something inside me felt exposed. The next day, I gathered the required documents: pension stubs, bank statements, proof of property. Each form seemed to demand an explanation I couldn't give. "How much longer do you plan to live?" was the question. None of them asked, but all of them implied. I mailed the packet in a thick manila envelope, sealing it with more force than necessary. As it slid through the post office slot, I realized that proving my worth had become its own quiet battle, a fight against years of being told my best days were behind me. That night I returned to the hospital. Arlo was sleeping, his tiny fists curled against his chest. The nurse dimmed the lights, and I sat by his incubator, tracing the reflection of my hand against the glass. I'd spent most of my life building walls to protect what I loved. Now the same walls felt like obstacles. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of breaking them down. Because somewhere inside this endless maze of forms and signatures, a boy with my blood was learning to breathe. And that was reason enough to start again. Detective Kincaid called just after dawn. Her voice was sharper than usual, the kind of tone that meant she had news that didn't fit neatly into guilt or innocence. "Mrs. Greylake," she said, "we've found something. I'd like you to come to the station." The drive into Duluth was quiet, the snowmelt running in thin silver lines along the roadside. The world outside looked washed clean, but I'd learned better. Some stains just sank deeper where eyes couldn't reach. Farah met me at the front desk. She wore the same charcoal coat, her expression caught between caution and resolve. She led me through a hallway lined with photos of officers, long-retired men and women, frozen mid-smile. Inside her office, the blinds were half-closed, sunlight striping the desk in pale bars. 2 folders sat open beside a steaming paper cup of coffee. "We located a silver sedan identical to your daughter's," she began. "Same make, same model, even the same partial plate. But it's not registered to Leda. It belongs to a man named Dorian Kells." The name landed like a forgotten echo. "Dorian," I repeated, my voice smaller than I expected. "He was her boyfriend years ago. I thought she left him." Farah nodded. "We pulled DMV records. Kells purchased that vehicle about 6 months ago. Around the same time, your daughter stopped appearing on any rental or employment logs." I felt the room tilt slightly. "You think he's involved?" "I think he's central," Farah said. "We also subpoenaed burner phone data linked to a prepaid card purchased under one of his aliases. There were messages, threats disguised as ultimatums." She handed me a printed sheet. The text exchanges were brief but unmistakable. "D, you owe me. Don't make me remind you what happens when you embarrass me. L. I said I'd fix it. Please stop calling. D. Not until you do exactly what I said. The problem disappears. We both walk away clean." Farah's voice softened. "We believe he was coercing her. We can't yet confirm what problem he meant, but based on the timeline, it could be the pregnancy." My throat went dry. "He knew about the baby." "It appears so. We traced a payment $5,000 from one of Kells's shell companies to Leda's old account 3 weeks before her disappearance. The memo line reads, 'Clearing the debt.'" I stared at the paper, the words blurring. All this time I'd pictured my daughter as cruel, heartless. But now a darker shape emerged behind her, the kind that feeds on fear, the kind that wears love like a disguise. Farah leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "We're checking his last known address. He moved frequently, motel records, temporary leases, nothing consistent. But his name keeps surfacing near your daughter's digital trail. Social media posts, encrypted calls, purchases logged under her card. He controlled her money, her phone, maybe even her movements." The thought of Leda under someone else's command made my chest ache. "So she wasn't free," I murmured. "She wasn't deciding anything." Farah nodded once. "It's possible she didn't throw that suitcase alone. Or maybe she thought she didn't have another choice." The sentence cracked something open inside me. For months, my anger had been the only thing keeping me upright. Anger was cleaner than heartbreak, easier to carry. But now guilt seeped in where fury used to live. If she had been trapped, if every terrible act had been survival instead of malice, then I had failed her twice, first as a mother and then as her judge. Farah closed the folder and stood. "We'll find her," she said quietly. "And when we do, I need you to remember she might not look like the person you remember. Control leaves marks we can't always see. Outside, the wind had picked up scattering salt and snow along the pavement. I paused before getting into my car, watching the city blur through the windshield. Somewhere out there, my daughter was alive, carrying the weight of choices that might not have been hers to make. The anger that once burned in me now felt like a wound slowly closing, replaced by something heavier, but truer compassion, twisted with grief. Because if Leda had been the villain in my story, then someone else had written the script. The phone rang just as the sun began to sink behind the trees, turning the lake the color of tarnished copper. I almost didn't answer. These days, the only people who called were nurses or officials, with forms that made kindness sound like protocol. But something in the rhythm of the ringing, too urgent, too human, pulled me toward it. Hello? There was silence at first, only static, and the faint hum of wind. Then a voice trembling and familiar. Mom! I froze. The word felt like a ghost brushing my ear. Leda. A breath caught on the other end, sharp and unsteady. I didn't want to. You have to believe me. My knees went weak. I steadied myself against the counter. Where are you? Are you safe? I can't stay long, she whispered. He's watching. I tried to leave, but the sound of shuffling broke through, followed by a male voice, deep and controlled, the kind that smiles while it bites. You shouldn't be calling her Leda. The blood in my hands turned cold. Dorian Kells, I said before I could stop myself. Ah, he said smoothly. So you've heard of me. Then you know I don't appreciate interference. The woman you're speaking to owes me something that belongs to both of us. Leda's breath hitched. Please don't. Quiet, he snapped. Then addressing me again, his tone hardened. I know you have the paperwork, the will, the trust, all those tidy little numbers sitting in your lawyer's cabinet. You're going to bring them to me, along with the child. My heart thudded so hard it hurt. You'll never touch him. He laughed, a short, humorless sound. That's not your decision anymore. You want your daughter to live. You'll meet me, Granite Boathouse, tomorrow, dusk. The line clicked dead. For a moment, the world went still. The refrigerator hummed, a floorboard creaked, and somewhere outside the faint cry of a loon carried across the water. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, my body trembling with the effort to understand what had just happened. Then I moved. It wasn't reason guiding me, it was something older, more instinctive. I grabbed my coat keys and the folder of documents I hadn't shown anyone but Farah. The will, the property ledger, the clause about the grandchild. It all suddenly felt radioactive, as if the ink itself could draw blood. I drove straight to the Duluth precinct. The evening sky bruised into purple headlights, glinting off half-melted ice. Inside, the fluorescent lights burned too bright. Farah looked up from her desk, startled to see me. He called, I said, breathless. She called first, then he took the phone. He wants a meeting. Her expression shifted instantly. Calm professionalism layered over alarm. Where the Granite Boathouse? Tomorrow. He said dusk. Farah's pen was already moving. We'll need to wire you, she said quietly, and we'll control the perimeter. No heroics. I'm not afraid, I said, though my voice betrayed me. He's using her. He'll kill her if he thinks he's lost control. Farah stood, resting a hand on my shoulder. Then we make sure he loses it on our terms. Back home, the lake had gone black beneath the rising moon. I sat by the window, the same chair where I'd once read to Leda as a child, and watched the reflection of the porch light tremble on the frozen surface. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, but for the first time since the night of the suitcase, I knew exactly what had to be done. Tomorrow, I would go to the Granite Boathouse. And this time, I wouldn't be the one watching from the shore. The storm had been building all morning, a low growl rolling in from the lake, heavy with sleet. By noon, the horizon had vanished behind a wall of gray. It seemed fitting that the day I agreed to face the man who'd destroyed my family would arrive wrapped in weather meant to test nerve. At the Duluth precinct, Detective Farrah Kincaid laid out the plan with her usual precision. A county map spread across the table, its edges curling from use. The granite boathouse was circled in red, a small dot near the frozen shoreline, cut off by trees, and a single unlit access road. "We'll position 2 cars at the trailhead," she said, tracing a line with her pen. "Another team will cover the north approach. You'll park here." She tapped the map and keep the line open. "If the signal drops, hold your position until visual contact." She slid a small velvet case toward me. Inside lay something that looked almost innocent, a smooth black button with a pin clasp on the back. "It's a mic," Farrah said. "Press the top twice to activate. Once you're there, keep your phone in your coat pocket. Don't draw attention to it." Her assistant, Officer Rayner, adjusted the frequencies on a small receiver, frowning. "Storm's going to cut range by half," he muttered. "If we lose you, it might take a few minutes to re-establish contact." Farrah gave me a steady look. "We'll be close, but not close enough to stop time." "You understand?" I nodded. "I've been too late once already." She didn't argue. Instead, she showed me how to attach the wire to my lapel, how to hide it beneath the collar of my coat. Her hands were sure, gentle, as if she understood that this wasn't courage, it was necessity disguised as resolve. Before leaving, I asked to see Arlo. Keely met me at the NICU entrance. Her scrubs wrinkled her hair, pulled back. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "He's stronger today," she said softly, heart rate steady breathing on his own for nearly an hour. "I need him moved tonight," I said. "Farrah's team can arrange secure placement with Child Protective Services. Somewhere no one can find him." Keely hesitated. "He's safe here. Not if Dorian decides he isn't." Her face tightened with understanding. She nodded once. "I'll make the call." When I stepped into the nursery, the lights were dim. Machines hummed softly, the room warm against the storm that raged beyond the windows. Arlo lay sleeping, his tiny hands curled beside his face, the rise and fall of his chest almost too small to see. I sat in the chair beside the crib and traced a fingertip along the edge of his blanket. "You'll be somewhere safe tomorrow," I whispered. "Somewhere no one can reach you." A nurse walked by, adjusting the monitors. I waited until she left, then leaned closer. "Your mother loved you," I said quietly. "She just forgot how to protect what she loved." "I won't." The storm hit the hospital windows, wind howling against glass. I stood pressing my hand to the incubator's side for one last moment. His warmth met my palm through the plastic. When I turned away, the air outside felt sharper, colder, but I carried that warmth with me. Back at the station, Farrah checked the wire one last time, the static crackling faintly through the receiver. "You don't have to do this," she said. "Yes," I answered. "I do." The storm swallowed the city as I stepped out into the night, the road ahead disappearing into sleet. Somewhere beyond that curtain of weather waited truth, and I had already decided I would pay for it whatever the cost. The storm had swallowed the sky whole by the time I reached the granite boathouse. Rain hammered the roof like fists, and the lake beyond it roared under the wind. The old structure loomed at the edge of the water, its wood swollen from years of neglect, its windows glowing faintly from a single hanging bulb inside. I parked where Farrah had told me, halfway down the gravel road, headlights off. The air smelled of wet pine and rust. My hands trembled as I lifted the empty baby carrier from the passenger seat, the decoy. A small wool blanket folded neatly inside gave it weight. I whispered the name Arlo once, as though the word itself might lend me courage. The walk to the boathouse felt endless. Each gust of wind pushed cold rain into my face, blurring the world into water and darkness. When I reached the door, it gave under my hand with a low, aching groan. Inside, the smell of mold and motor oil clung to everything. The wooden planks creaked beneath my shoes and water dripped steadily from the rafters. I took a step forward, clutching the carrier close, my coat heavy with rain. Leda, my voice cracked against the storm. I'm here. A movement flickered near the far wall. She stepped out of the shadows, pale, hollow-eyed, her hair plastered to her face. The sight of her nearly undid me. She looked smaller than I remembered, her shoulders drawn inward, as though trying to disappear into herself. "Mom," she whispered. "You shouldn't have come." Her voice shook, but it was still hers, the same tone she used when she was little and afraid of thunder. I set the carrier gently on the ground. "Where is he?" Leda's gaze darted toward the dark corner behind her. "Don't," she started, but the rest of the sentence died in her throat. A door slammed open behind her. Dorian Kells emerged from the shadows, his silhouette sharp against the dim light. He was taller than I remembered from photographs, his face half covered by a hood, but the arrogance was unmistakable. He carried a handgun like it was part of his hand, not an accessory, but an extension. "Well," he said, smirking, "if it isn't the Saint of the Lake. You've caused me a fair bit of trouble, Mrs. Greylake." Leda flinched at his tone. "Don't," she whispered. "Please don't do this." Dorian ignored her. He circled me slowly, each boot step deliberate. "You brought the documents, didn't you? The trust, the will, proof that your bloodline is worth something. That's all any of this ever was. You used her," I said, forcing the words through my fear. "You made her believe she had no choice." He stopped, cocking his head like a man humoring a story he'd already rewritten. "Choice, no. Mrs. Greylake, I gave her a future. She just didn't understand the terms." He turned to Leda. "Show her." Leda's hands shook as she pulled a crumpled envelope from her coat pocket. Inside were the same financial documents I'd brought to the police, photocopies, smudged and creased. "He made me," she said, voice breaking. "He said he'd hurt the baby if I didn't." The words cut through the air like glass. Dorian laughed low and cold. Dramatic as always. "You should be thanking me. I kept her alive, didn't I?" The suitcase was theater, a reminder of what obedience looks like. My body went still. I felt the wire against my collar, the small button beneath my coat. My thumb pressed down once, twice, the silent signal Farah had drilled into me. Dorian noticed the motion too late. "What did you—" The storm outside cracked with thunder, drowning his words. I stepped back, keeping my eyes on him, pretending fear was all I had left. Leda moved first. She stepped between us, arms out. "Don't," she shouted. "Get out of the way," he snapped, raising the gun. Lightning flashed through the broken window, lighting her face in that split second. And in that flash, I saw everything, the child I'd raised, the woman she'd become, and the hollow years that had carved them apart. She trembled, but didn't move. Her voice came out barely louder than the rain. "You've taken enough from me." The sound of sirens reached us faintly through the storm, their echo lost in the wind. Dorian's face shifted, arrogance giving way to panic. He turned toward the door, gun still raised as red and blue light flickered against the wet wood. And then the world broke open into noise. The first shot split the storm in half. I didn't feel it right away, only the jolt, the sound like the world exhaling too fast. My shoulder burned a second later, heat spreading down my arm in a wave that stole my breath. I stumbled back against the wall, gripping the edge of a support beam slick with rainwater. Dorian stood at the center of the boathouse, gun raised, eyes wide, with something close to madness. The sirens outside were louder now, flashing through the cracks in the wooden walls. He swung toward the door, then back toward me, trapped between his fear and his arrogance. Leda screamed his name, darting forward. "Stop, please," he turned on her. "You told them. You led them here, I didn't," she cried. "I didn't tell anyone." Another flash of lightning illuminated everything. The gun, her outstretched hand, my blood darkening the floorboards. I saw the instant before it happened, the small shift of his wrist, the tightening of his jaw. There wasn't time to think. Lita lunged, pushing me sideways just as the second shot exploded. The bullet shattered the wall above us, wood splintering, dust falling like snow. She fell to her knees beside me, shaking her breath, coming in shallow bursts. He moved toward us again, fury drowning reason. "You ruined everything," he hissed. "Both of you." Outside, the crunch of tires on gravel cut through the storm. A voice shouted. Farah's sharp and clear police dropped the weapon. For 3 seconds, the world froze. The gun hung mid-air, trembling in Dorian's grip. His eyes flicked toward the doorway, toward the light cutting through the rain. In that sliver of time, I thought he might surrender. Then he raised the gun again. Farah fired first. The report echoed through the boathouse, deafening final. Dorian's body jerked, then folded backward, the weapon clattering to the floor. He hit the boards with a thud that felt like an ending. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was stunned hollow, heavy with everything that had been lost before the sound even died. Leda crawled toward me, her hands shaking. "Mom," she whispered, pressing her palm against the wound in my shoulder. "You're bleeding." "I've had worse," I lied. My voice came out softer than I meant. Farah's team flooded the room, shouts, boots, radios crackling. 2 officers pulled Dorian's gun away. Another called for the paramedics waiting outside. Farah knelt beside me, her face pale under the flickering light. "Stay still," she said. "Help's here." But my eyes were on Leda. She sat on the floor, her hands slick with my blood, tears cutting lines through the dirt on her face. She looked at me like a child again, terrified, desperate for permission to exist. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I didn't know what to do. I thought if I just did what he said." Her words dissolved into air. I wanted to reach for her to tell her that forgiveness wasn't a sentence but a beginning, but my arm wouldn't move. Farah's voice called something to the medics, but it sounded distant. The lights blurred into streaks, the storm's rhythm fading beneath the rush of footsteps. Leda's hand slipped into mine, cold and trembling. For the first time in years, I didn't pull away. The sirens outside quieted, replaced by the soft, relentless beating of rain on the roof. And in that fragile silence between breaths, everything we'd destroyed began slowly to return to life. The courthouse smelled of wet paper and disinfectant, the kind of sterile air that made every sound echo longer than it should. Snow had melted into gray slush along the steps outside, and the flag above the entrance hung limp in the wind. Inside, everything felt both too quiet and too loud. At once, footsteps murmured voices, the shuffle of legal documents that decided who was guilty and who was broken. It had been 3 weeks since the night at the boathouse. My shoulder was still bandaged, but the wound beneath it had already begun to knit. The one inside hadn't. Detective Farah Kincaid met me outside the courtroom. She wore her plain gray coat again, eyes tired but steady. "They're finalizing the charges today," she said. "You don't have to go in if you'd rather wait." "I'll stay," I said. It started with me. It should end where I can see it. The proceedings were brief, stripped of the drama the newspapers later tried to paint. Dorian Kells sat slouched in his chair, wrists cuffed, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. He barely looked human anymore, just another man cornered by his own lies. The prosecutor listed the charges: conspiracy, attempted murder, coercive control, extortion, words that sounded too neat for what he had done. When the judge read the verdict, Dorian didn't flinch. 20 years with no chance of parole. His lawyer whispered something, and he smirked once before they let him away. I expected to feel satisfaction, but all I felt was a quiet exhaustion, as though justice had arrived too late to matter. Then came Leda's turn. She stood pale and trembling beside her attorney, wearing the same gray sweater I'd seen her in at the hospital. Her eyes found me only once, and in them I saw neither defiance nor self-pity, just absence like a candle's final flicker after the flame has burned too low. Her lawyer spoke softly about coercion, manipulation, and fear, about years of dependency that had eroded her sense of self until obedience felt like survival. The plea agreement was simple psychiatric treatment at a rehabilitation center in St. Paul, supervised for no less than 5 years. In exchange, she surrendered all parental rights. When the judge confirmed it, Leda nodded. She didn't cry. She just looked at her hands folded tightly together and whispered something I couldn't hear. Outside, the wind cut through the courthouse corridor, carrying with it the smell of rain and thawing earth. Farah walked beside me. "It's the best outcome we could have hoped for," she said. "I know," I replied, "but it still feels like a funeral." At the end of the hallway, Orlane Brecht waited with a folder tucked against her chest. "The court has declared the child a ward of the state," she told me, "pending your custody hearing next month. You've met every requirement. It's a matter of formalities now." I signed the temporary papers with hands that trembled less than before. On the last page, the name Arlo Greylake appeared again, in clean black ink, steady and certain. Seeing it there made something inside me finally settle. Farah clasped my uninjured shoulder gently. "You saved more than you lost," she said. I nodded, though the truth of that was harder to believe. Outside, the light was softening, and the courthouse doors opened onto a gray afternoon that felt like neither victory nor defeat, only release. When I looked back through the glass, I caught a glimpse of Leda being led down a separate corridor. Her figure was small against the wide, sterile walls, but for a moment she turned and looked over her shoulder. It wasn't a plea or an apology. It was acknowledgement. Silent, fragile, real. And somehow that was enough to keep me standing as the day folded into rain. By April, the snow had melted into ribbons of water that carved through the yard and disappeared into the lake. The ice was gone, but its memory lingered a stillness that reminded me how long winter could live inside a person. The custody process began quietly, without ceremony. Letters, appointments, signatures. Each form felt heavier than the one before it, as though love needed to be proven in paragraphs and notarized in triplicate. The first step was the medical evaluation. A nurse at St. Luke's, barely older than Leda had been when she left home, checked my reflexes and blood pressure with polite efficiency. "You're in remarkable health," she said, scribbling notes. "Most women your age wouldn't take on this kind of responsibility." I smiled thinly. Most women my age haven't had to start over. The home inspection followed a week later. Orlane arrived with her tablet again, her professionalism softened by something almost kind. She noticed the new locks on the cabinets, the safety gate at the stairs, and the framed photo of Arlo on the mantel, a hospital printout, tiny hand curled into a fist. "You've done everything right," she said as she typed. "I'll note that." The court interviews came last. The waiting room outside the family division was crowded with voices, young parents whispering anxiously, lawyers checking their phones, children clutching stuffed animals like proof they belonged somewhere. I sat alone, folder on my lap, the faint hum of the vending machine behind me filling the silence. When they called my name, I entered a small chamber where Judge Marin Colfax presided. She was in her 60s, her silver hair tied neatly back, her gaze sharp but not unkind. She read my file, flipping through pages as though weighing each line against the space between my words. "You understand the obligations this petition entails?" she asked. "I do," I said. "I've already lived most of them." That earned the smallest curve of her mouth. "You have 2 character references here, Nurse Keeley Sands and Father Brenner, from St. Luke's Parish. Strong letters, both." Keeley's note had been simple. She doesn't hesitate when life asks for courage. Father Brenner's longer. Some love comes loud. Hers does not, but it stays. The judge closed the folder and looked at me for a long moment. Temporary custody is approved pending review in 6 months. For a second, the air in the room shifted the weight of months of fear and waiting, lifting just enough to let me breathe. When I stepped outside, Keely was waiting by the door, a paper cup of coffee in each hand. Well, I nodded, and for once, I let myself smile. That evening, I walked through the house, turning on the porch light, though no one was coming. On the table sat a single sheet of paper. Order of temporary custody. My name inked beside Arlo's. The legal language was cold, but beneath it, I saw something alive, proof that love could be written down without losing its warmth. The day Arlo came home, the air smelled of lilac and clean laundry. Spring had finally taken root along the lake, the kind of quiet thaw that happens slowly without asking permission. The child services car pulled into the driveway just after noon. From the porch, I watched Orlane step out first, followed by the young foster nurse carrying a woven carrier. Inside it, bundled in a blue knit blanket, was the boy who had changed the shape of my life without ever meaning to. He was heavier now, his cheeks full and warm. When she placed him in my arms, his head fit perfectly beneath my chin, as though my body had been waiting for that exact weight. Orlane smiled, the first true smile I'd ever seen from her. "He knows your voice," she said. Every time you visited, he turned toward the sound. I didn't trust myself to speak. Instead, I nodded and brushed a finger across his small hand. The nurses left after the paperwork was signed, leaving the house wrapped in a silence that no longer felt empty. That afternoon, I hung the small brass plaque beside the door. The words glinted in the light, "Home by consent only." A reminder that belonging was not possession, that love, like entry, had to be offered, never taken. Inside, I moved slowly through each room, showing Arlo the life that would now be his. The nursery by the window, the soft quilt folded over the rocking chair, the old radio on the kitchen shelf. He blinked up at the ceiling as though the light itself was new. Evening came soft and blue. I fed him by the window, the bottle warm in my hand, the lake just visible beyond the glass. His breathing steadied against me, and the rhythm of it quieted the part of my mind that still waited for the phone to ring, for someone to say it was all a mistake. After I laid him in the crib, I sat nearby and hummed a lullaby my mother used to sing when storms shook the house. The melody wove through the stillness, thin but certain. Arlo's fingers twitched once, then relaxed. When I turned off the lamp, the reflection of the brass plaque shimmered faintly in the dark hallway, its letters catching the last of the porch light. 2 days later, a letter arrived, postmarked from St. Paul. No return address, just my name written in a hand I would have recognized anywhere. Inside was a postcard worn at the edges, showing the city skyline under evening light. Only one line was written on the back: "Tell him I'm sorry." No signature, but none was needed. I read it twice, then placed it on the mantel beside the photo of Arlo from the hospital. The ink had smudged slightly, as though tears or rain had blurred it. I didn't know which. Outside, wind brushed through the birch trees, and the lake shimmered in the fading light. I left the porch door open, letting the scent of lilac drift in. Forgiveness didn't arrive with trumpets or tears. It came quietly, like this evening, like the soft sound of a baby sleeping in the next room, like the knowledge that peace was not owed but earned. I turned off the light and let the darkness settle warm and calm around us both. Years passed the way soft rain wears down stone, slowly, kindly, without notice. The house by the lake no longer carried the echo of grief, only the sound of life filling the quiet spaces. Arlo was 7 now, all freckles and yield curls, his laughter rolling through the yard like birdsong. He spent the afternoons by the water building forts out of driftwood and skipping stones that never quite reached the far shore. I watched from the porch, the same chair that had once been a place of waiting, now simply a place of rest. The brass plaque still hung by the door. Home by consent only. Its surface had dulled with weather, but the words remained clear, untouched by time. Every so often, Arlo asked what it meant, and I always told him the same thing, that everything worth loving asks first. The tea beside me had gone warm, the cup rimmed with sunlight. Evening drifted in slow and gold. The lake mirrored the sky perfectly, as if both had agreed to keep each other's secrets. From the kitchen window, soft music played a piano piece Leda used to hum under her breath when she studied late at night. On the porch table stood a single-framed photograph. Leda, 25, smiling at something just outside the frame, her hair swept back by wind. It had been taken the summer before she met Dorian, when she still called me every Sunday just to talk about nothing. The picture wasn't forgiveness, but it was the closest thing to it. Arlo's voice broke through the hum of cicadas. "Grandma, watch this." He flung a stone into the air. It landed with a plunk that sent ripples spreading toward the horizon. I called back, smiling. As dusk settled, I rose and switched on the porch light. Its glow spilled over the steps, soft and steady, cutting through the blue of evening. I stood there a while, hands around my cup, watching the light tremble against the lake. "Some lights stay on," I whispered, not for guidance, but for grace. Arlo turned toward me, waving his outline small against the water. And as the night deepened, the house, the lake, and the light all seemed to breathe in unison, quiet, patient, whole.